Dr. Scott went home that day. Wisely decided not to tell his wife about anything he'd learned. It'd be many years till he told his children and them their children. But when he did, he followed the story by saying that many times in that next year, he would be awakened from a restless sleep, almost sure that he'd heard a sharp rapping on his door. The few times he did go down and check, the only thing that was there was the night and the wind. A few years later, lightning struck the house and it burned to the ground, and today, no one knows where it ever was. But when the great-granddaughter of Dr. Uriah Scott finished telling me her story, she fished in her purse for just a second and came up with a yellow newspaper clipping. It was a clipping from the 50s about a housing development out east of LaPorte that had been built after World War II, and about a strange series of pranks that had occurred there. It seems that after the houses were built and the first neighbors moved in, they all began to report the same thing, that late at night they'd hear a sharp rapping on their door, and when they went there, there was nothing there. They called in the police and they investigated, but they couldn't figure out who would do something like that. The great-granddaughter of Dr. Uriah Scott thinks she knows. She thinks that somewhere out there, out east of LaPorte, in the midst of the wind and the rain, on a night maybe like this, the old man still rides, seeking redemption, forgiveness, maybe just seeking to give his daughter the help in death that he never gave her in life. That's the Doctor's Erie House Call. You guys are very patient, and I appreciate it. I love, like I say, I hope it's obvious, I love these kinds of ghost stories. And as I've been doing the research for a lot of years on these ghost stories, I've actually learned a lot about our area here that I never even knew, okay? I love when I go into schools, I go into high schools and junior highs, and I go to kids who think that history is boring, you know? History is just dates and things like that. And I say, you know what, how about this one? Where do you think the where do you think occurred the train crash that was the worst train crash in terms of loss of human life in the first half of the 20th century? Where did it happen?
Hammond.
Hammond. Hammond. Yep. The Hagenbeck-Wallace circus train in June of 1917. They had done a show in Michigan City, and they were due to do a show the next day in Hammond. Well, there was actually two trains. The first was the equipment and the roustabouts. Those were sort of the workers, the blue-collar types, whose only job it was to set up the circus. As they rolled along into Hammond that night, they got something called a hot box. Now, I had to check out what that is. But what it is on the gearbox, and somebody may correct me here, if there's a railroad person here, I've been corrected before, but my understanding is there's a gearbox on each of the axles in a car. And when the grease runs low, that box actually begins to glow hot. And they had to stop. They had to stop to grease up the box. Well, what they didn't know was they stopped, and the lights were red behind them. That coming in quick behind was an empty troop train bound for Chicago to pick up troops for World War I. The conductor that night had been up about 30 hours and he was dead asleep at the switch. He hit the back of that train doing about 35 miles an hour. Understand, please, the train was built of wood, and what was worse is the lamps inside were actually gasoline powered. So the inferno that quickly developed killed better than 60 lives. It was a horrible, horrible event. Actually, it's kind of interesting. The way I found this and began investigating it is because of a non-ghost story. Okay? What happened was a lot of the roustabouts, they didn't have names, they didn't have identification, and some of them were literally burned beyond recognition. So they went to a cemetery in Chicago where the circus union had plots. It's called Showman's Rest. And they buried them there. And then what they did is they erected statues of elephants, which is a circus symbol, with their trunks lowered in grief over these graves. Well, over time, the legend developed incorrectly that there had been actually circus animals killed and that they were buried there too. But then, and this actually did happen, something really strange. People began going by that Shulman's Rest late at night, began to actually hear the calls of wild animals. They began to hear it, and the rumor began in the community that the ghosts of these wild animals were haunting the cemetery. Well, it kind of got out for a long time until finally, in the late 70s, a Chicago police officer on duty one night decided to check it out. He didn't believe it, of course, but he pulled up at Shulman's Rest, got out, and he was shocked that he actually did hear it. He actually heard these wild animals. He couldn't believe it. But still somewhat of a skeptic, he decided to do an investigation. And believe it or not, he went back and he did one thing that nobody had done. He looked at a map and realized that the cemetery was about a half mile directly behind Brookfield Zoo. And sure enough, at night, when the animals are most active, the wind was carrying the sound. But when I was doing the investigation on that, I did read one line, and this is kind of how this happens. You get one blip on the radar, one line that said, however, there have been persistent reports of a haunting on the tracks where the accident happened, and that's all. It took me 2.5 years to be able to fill in that one line. Finally, it led me to the daughter of somebody who'd been the line maintenance supervisor. And she began to tell me stories that her dad had told her about how trains at night going through that section into Hammond began to wire in almost hysterical reports that they had seen a fire along the side of the tracks, or that they had seen something that appeared to be a wreck as they were pulling in. One person on a train even went so far as to stop his train and get out, and what he described, he said, the night was clear and it was silent. And as soon as he jumped off of his train, he said it was like jumping into hell. Because he said, even though he could only see the quiet of that night, what he heard was the crackling of flames and the screaming of people. He said he heard all of this commotion and people screaming and people running, and he could even smell something that smelled like burning wood and gasoline, and then it was gone. That lady began the story for me that took me probably another 4 or 5 months to begin to do before it had enough evidence to be able to do a story. But that's one of the stories from this area. Being as we're in Purdue, Cal Hammond, you know, you guys actually have some pretty good haunts here. The Ghost of Klein Avenue.